Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Werewolf Break-ins. Dear Scary Stories NYC, the first time my wife and I owned our own home, it was in the 1970s in a nice area that turned out to be too long a drive to Detroit where I worked. We were in what was then a wooded area in Porter Township in Michigan, and it would usually take me almost 3 hours to drive into Detroit from there, and then the same coming home at night. But it was my first executive job, and we were desperate to become homeowners so that we could have kids. Those used to be normal things most people got to do back in those before times. We didn't feel privileged either, we felt average, and we really were too. Like for instance, we got pests in our basement like so many other average Americans of that bygone era. Only because we had moved out to rural Michigan, we didn't get mice or bugs down there. We had man-sized warring dogmen or werewolves. I grew up in Michigan, and my grandpa told me stories of the Michigan Dogman when I was a boy. He mainly seemed to be telling me them as cautionary tales to get me to obey my parents. Like he would say, obey your parents or the Michigan Dogman will get you. But he told me a number of different stories, and only a couple of them really had a moral or seemed like a story to begin with. The rest seemed like sighting encounters to me. Like he would tell me about a girl being followed home by a dogman, and then he would end the story by lecturing me that I would have to see the dogman in real life if I ever disobeyed my parents. Like he would tack that onto the ending, but the stories were almost never about kids who disobeyed their parents. And the stories seemed pretty realistic to me. Let me see if I can remember any of my grandpa's stories. He passed on when I was still quite young. Okay, like one time he told me there was this very virtuous young lady who was engaged to marry a very nice and rich man. The two of them had their entire lives ahead of them, when one night, while taking a shortcut home through the woods, the virtuous young lady was set upon by the dogman. I asked what happened to that lady, and Grandpa told me that nobody knew for certain. But the general opinion was that she was eaten by the dogman, and that I would be too if I disobeyed my parents. I asked if the virtuous young lady had disobeyed her parents, and Grandpa was like, "What? No, she was virtuous. She always obeyed her parents." So I was like, seems as though the dogman doesn't really care if anyone obeys their parents or not. Finally, he started ending the stories by saying that if I misbehaved, he would personally drag me out into the woods and leave me for the dogman. I kinda saw my grandpa as a bit of a psychotic from that point onward, but at least his cautionary tales made more logical sense. Life is nothing without narrative structure after all. So the event I'm trying to lead up to happened the first time my wife and I left the house alone for a weekend. It was the time we went to stay with my wife's parents for I think it was Labor Day weekend? Whichever weekend was the Jerry Lewis weekend, because I remember they were watching Jerry Lewis on TV, raising money for charity. So we didn't get home until it was dark on Monday evening, and we were both beat. It had been a hectic weekend, and a stressful drive home through unending traffic that took much longer than we had anticipated or hoped. I remember that we basically zombie walked up to our bedroom, got out of our traveling clothes, and collapsed into bed. I know I fell asleep immediately because I was awakened by my wife shortly thereafter. She was asking me what that noise was, and I thought she was telling me that I was snoring. She was actually asking me to wake up and listen to a strange noise that she kept hearing, while I kept apologizing for snoring because I was too tired to understand her. Then, out of nowhere, came a loud banging sound that shook the entire house, followed by a roar that sounded nothing like a lion, but also like nothing else either of us had ever heard. That woke me up like drinking 3 cups of coffee while sticking my finger in a live electric socket. I asked my wife if I had just dreamed a roaring animal downstairs, and she said that if I had, then she must be in my dream with me because she heard it too. Now, I don't want to get back into how much superior my generation was compared to everyone who's come after us, but we were a lot braver than the chickens they call men these days. I grabbed my baseball bat, made of wood, thank you, not aluminum foil, and I made my way downstairs, ready to brain whatever animal had somehow gotten into our house. Now, since it sounded like a roar, I was guessing it would be a big cat, like a mountain lion. I was getting ready for something to either leap up off the floor at me or else hide somewhere high and drop down onto me. I know cats will do those two things. I made it downstairs and did not see any animals, so I walked around as quietly as I could, just observing and listening. When I heard something fall off a shelf down in the basement, I knew I had to go further downstairs. Tiptoeing to the kitchen, I opened the creaky kitchen door as quietly as I could, and I listened to what was happening in the basement. It was very dark down there, and I couldn't see anything but shadow from where I was standing looking down from the kitchen. After it was quiet for a while, I walked gingerly down some of the wooden steps, one at a time, bending down to squint into the darkness. I got all the way to the bottom without noticing any movement, and I figured the noises had to be coming from the other room, which we were using as storage. This room had our hot water heater and gas heating, so I was somewhat relieved that the animal wasn't messing with those. Turning a corner, I saw the door to the storage room was opened, and we always kept that shut. I thought about going back upstairs to get a flashlight, but I realized that I would only give away my position to whatever it was that I was about to have to deal with. I remember closing my eyes and praying. Then I stepped as quietly as I could into that storage room in our basement, and I looked around, and then I ducked down behind some boxes. There was not a big animal in our basement storage room. There were two big animals in our basement storage room, and these were not big cats either. Initially in the darkness, I thought they were two gorillas, but really tall ones that did not slouch. That idea transformed in my head to the notion that they might be Bigfoot. I was frightened, not that I had interrupted a fight, but rather some sort of Sasquatch mating ritual taking place under my own roof. But the sounds they were making were distinctly canine, and after some time, as my eyes got adjusted to the lack of light, I noticed how long their snouts were in profile. They were neither feline nor ape-like. They were big, hairy gorilla men, but with wolf-like heads. Now, these two individuals seemed to be having some sort of a disagreement. I couldn't really tell if they were both males, but they were the same size, and that was double extra large. They were bigger than I was, probably 7 feet tall, and they seemed to be raging at each other. They occasionally lifted boxes and threw them at each other. It was a ridiculous display. I don't think it was a mating display, though. I think they were just two very large monsters arguing over the small space in my basement. My hands were sweating profusely, as was the rest of me, and I let the bat slip out of my grip. It made a fairly loud noise on the hard basement floor before I was able to grab it back up again. When I looked back at the two dogmen, they were no longer arguing and bickering with each other. Now they seemed far more interested in me. Rather than immediately turning tail and running back upstairs, though, I banged the bat head on the ground and I challenged the beastmen to dare come any closer. I gave them the look of utter hatred and anger, and I showed that I was unafraid. This seemed to greatly impress or at least confuse both of them. There was an incredible, eternal moment where I got to look into the eyes of one of them, and then the other, back and forth, and none of the three of us moved anything except our eyes for those few seconds. And then that moment was over and the dogman charged me with teeth and claws slicing the air and looking to slice me up as well. I ran upstairs just the same as any of you young chickens today would do it. Except I'm sure I ran much faster because my generation had so much more testosterone, as everybody knows. I made it upstairs and turned around to see the dogman both chase me to the staircase, but but neither had wanted to take a chance running up that rickety contraption behind me. Even the Dogman had too much sense for that. I locked the door and went upstairs. My wife asked me what was going on, and I told her I would deal with it in the morning, but that she should avoid the basement until I told her it was safe. She wasn't happy with that explanation, but she knew that I would only withhold information if I knew it would upset her, and she didn't like being upset, so she left me alone about it. In the morning, I drove a long nail through my bat, sharpened the end of it, and I went back downstairs for round 2. Only this time, there were no animals in my basement that I could find. None at all of any size, large or small. I discovered that the outside entrance to the basement had been busted into, and I got on the horn to Gus, who was our handyman in that neighborhood. He came by and had breakfast with us, and then went down to check out the damage and give us an estimate for repairs. I had him install a much higher security version of what was there prior, and that was the first and last time we had an issue with the Michigan Dogman invading our basement to use for his own purposes.
Let me start at the beginning and see how far I get. Okay, this was about 5 years ago when my family and I lived in rural Michigan. My parents both worked hard to create careers for themselves where they could work out of home and therefore live wherever they wanted. At first, they wanted to travel around like Billy Batson and Mentor in the ancient TV version of Shazam, visiting the entire country and having one long learning experience. The fact that they would then need to homeschool me wiped that idea out, since I was still in high school at the time, and they were not going to be able to homeschool me on algebra or whatever. So, because of these weird complications they hadn't foreseen, the dream of living on the road translated somehow into buying a house in Michigan of all places. I think they got it because it was cheap and had a lot of land around it, but it was scrubland, and the house was old and not in very good shape. My parents didn't want to do much to fix it up either, as they were still planning on hitting the road once I left for college. So, basically, it was a crappy life where we all exchanged our happiness for the idea that somewhere later down the road, we could resume trying to live our dreams. I was the only one in the family who thought this was a bit crazy. Mom and Dad had their heads buried in making their next deadlines and never really were able to think much past that. So, one time the three of us went shopping, which was a huge deal out there. We had to drive miles to get to a supermarket, so we tended to do one huge shopping every 5 or 6 weeks. The idea was to do it for 2 months, but nothing we got ever lasted 2 months. At any rate, this one time we were getting back from the supermarket just around dusk at night. It was starting to get darkish and the sky was turning colors, but it was still technically daytime. As we were getting stuff out of the back of the car and carrying it in, I saw something weird in the basement. Our basement had these small windows that were up about 6 or 6.5 feet off the ground. I remember they were over my head when I was in the basement, and I would have to look up to see out of them. On the outside, they were just slightly higher than ground level, just barely poking above the dirt. So when I looked down there and could swear I was seeing eyes looking back at me, that kind of surprised me more than a little. I brought the bag in the house, then asked my dad if he could come look at something with me. He said he would after we got done unpacking, but I asked him to come right then, and he did. We got back outside, and I looked at that window. Now there was nothing there. Undeterred, I brought Dad over and told him something had been staring at me from that window, but I wasn't sure if it was a person or an animal. Dad looked concerned and cursed under his breath. He bent down and peered in, but he still didn't see anything. He stood back up, looking as confused as I felt. "What do you think we should do?" he asked me plainly. "If it's a burglar, we need to call the cops. If it's an animal, we need to call animal control. And if it's your imagination, I need to call a shrink for you," he said, smiling and shoving my shoulder to demonstrate he was kidding about the last part. But he was right. I wasn't sure what we should do either. I stared at that window, wishing that whatever it was would show itself again. Dad suggested we finish unpacking everything before stuff melted, then figure out what to do afterward. I agreed that made sense, and we grabbed more bags and headed back inside with them. As we were putting food in the fridge and the pantry, we both heard my mother scream outside. I think we both thought the same thing, and we ran out there to the driveway to see what had scared her. You guessed it. She was staring in horror at that window, and she told us outright that she saw a dogman. She actually used that word and said she saw a dogman in our basement. Dad laughed, or like he snorted, trying to suppress a laugh, but I wasn't laughing. I asked her to describe it, and she said at first she thought she was looking at the face of a demon. It was glaring at her and baring its fangs. That stopped Dad's laughter. But Mom said the demon face pulled back from the window, and as it did, she could see dog ears on top and broad, muscular, human-like shoulders. Dad got right on his cell phone and called animal control, telling them that somehow a large, vicious, wild dog had gotten into their basement while they were out. He believed Mom about the dog part, but not about the shoulders part. He thought that was an illusion. Mom was furious and called the police, saying there was an intruder in her basement. The two of them were in full argument mode with each other when the animal control guys came, followed soon by the police. In both cases, Dad told them that his son and his wife had seen a very large dog somehow in our basement, but in both cases, Mom contradicted him and claimed it was a dogman. There were a lot of people exchanging weird glances that evening. So, the upshot of it was that animal control and the cops both went down there, and they both came up empty. No dogs, no burglars, and especially no dogman. The police warned my parents never to do anything like that again, and I knew that from then on, we were going to have to defend ourselves from whatever that thing was. That night, my parents argued loudly, and my father was forced to sleep downstairs on the couch. The weird upshot of that was that all night he was kept up by sounds of someone or something moving around underneath him in the basement. There had to be some way that whatever or whoever that was getting in and out. So the next morning, my father went down there searching around. He found nothing, no way in or out. Until, that is, he bumped into a big old metal cabinet down there and hurt his shoulder. While he was rubbing it and waiting for the pain to subside, Dad saw something behind the cabinet. pulling it away from the wall. He discovered a sort of a large rat hole. He called me down and showed it to me. He asked me if what I saw could have fit in that hole. I had only seen eyes, so I couldn't really know. Mom had seen a man-sized dog-headed thing, so she would say that the hole was too small. It was about the size of hole a poodle could fit through, but whatever we saw was large enough to look out that basement window, which is more than 6 feet off the ground. Dad said maybe it was a smaller dog and had jumped up to the window somehow. Dogs can jump, he informed me, and I said yes, I knew that, but I remained skeptical. Why? Because dogs can't pull large metal cabinets back over a hole they've just crawled through. That's why. Dad and I drove into some mall and got concrete and a metal plate, and we filled that hole and bolted that metal plate in front in case it really was a rat hole. My father said rats can eat concrete, or at least eat away at it, so the metal plate bolted onto the concrete was an extra precaution. When we were done, Mom came down and looked at what we had done and laughed at us. She said fixing a rat hole wasn't going to keep a Dogman out of the house. Yet, it did. We stopped hearing anything in the basement after that. It was one of those sort of shrug-your-shoulder moments for me and Mom, while Dad suspected we were both batty and imagining things.
His membership is no cheap stunt. Ron's been a channel member 47 months. Please join me in thanking the fine and wonderful Ron Barracuda for making this episode possible. Ron has been a channel member here at Scary Stories NYC for 47 months, which is, it's too high for a Bigfoot to count, that's what it is. I think that might be something like 4 years. So we want to say thank you to Ron Barracuda. Ron gets perks in return for his membership, and if you want to understand more about that, then listen to our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos, or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.